So this is why I think it's really fascinating, having spent a lot of time with Christian theologians in the past couple of years writing this book, is that the original conceit, I think, when you talk with people who are Christian and Jewish and you have sort of interfaith conversations, the original one-sentence conceit and the difference between them is that what you hear from Jews is Judaism is acts-based and Christianity is faith-based. Christianity is about the acceptance of Christ. When you accept Christ, then you've accepted what you need to accept and everything flows therefrom. And Judaism says it's not just about accepting God, it's all these mitzvot, right? There are all these commandments that you have to do, and these are what perfect you as a human being. It's the performance of these commandments, accepting God's sovereignty because he's the one who gave the commandments, but you actually have to act in the world, and if you don't act in the world, then you haven't fulfilled your responsibility in the world. I think that the reversal of the kosher laws in the New Testament, from a Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ, I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written...
He was just a prophet. Right?
No, we don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think he was?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So he became legend in story, and it became a bigger and bigger deal as time went on.
Yeah, he had a group of followers, and then that gradually grew, and then...
Do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a Jewish belief.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah, no, we're not into
we're not
into miracle stories. No, that's
no?
No.
You don't have any miracles?
No, not by Jesus. Right?
No?
They're ones in the Old Testament.
Ones?
Yeah, you've got Moses splitting the sea and all that.
What do you think happened there?
What do I think happened there?
Yeah.
Well, I'll go with the Maimonidean explanation that there was it says in the Bible there was a strong east wind. So there was a naturalistic explanation for a physical phenomenon.
Ben Shapiro, the darling of the conservative right and one of the best debaters in the 21st century in the political field. What you have just heard was a few snippets of two interviews that Ben Shapiro did, first with Dave Rubin and second one with Joe Rogan, talking about differences between Judaism, which he is an adherent to Judaism, and Christianity, and who he thought Jesus Christ really was. Interestingly, Ben Shapiro loves the Judeo-Christian founding of America, and he loves Christians too, and supports the Bible, even if he doesn't believe in Jesus. But ironically, he also thought and thinks that Jesus Christ was a common criminal who was crucified by the Roman Empire, totally going against all of the evidence of who Jesus Christ was. So what I will play next is his real awesome interview with William Lane Craig, which will showcase the evidence who Jesus Christ really was, and whether if Ben Shapiro is right and Jesus Christ was just a common criminal on whom billions of people have put their trust in, or whether Jesus Christ was actually who he said he was, the Son of God and God himself in human flesh, who was the Messiah that is going to save and was going to save Israel.
Arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God, and I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true, and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So, from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
Interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this: why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims. So
one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, I mean, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
You know, on the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. You know, that's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, you know, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because, and here I'm going to merge the two in terms of the idea of God personally speaking to people and giving them the morality of the Old Testament, which largely is reflected in the New Testament. And the New Testament is part of the Old Testament, according to Christians anyway. It reflects the chief morality of the Old Testament. It doesn't supplant it entirely. The Old Testament doesn't become a nothing just because the New Testament comes around. So that's why I'm now moving back toward the kind of theological question, which is, what's the purpose of the revelation? Meaning, would it be sufficient to work within the framework of the first half of our conversation with regard to sort of rational pushes not toward revelation and the presence of God in human form in Christianity, or the presence of God on top of a mountain in Judaism? Would a God of reason alone be sufficient? Or do you need to have, for what purpose do you need to have a God who is speaking directly to people at Sinai or speaking through Jesus in Christianity?
I think that the answer of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament can be put into one word: atonement. What is needed is atonement for sin. And in the Levitical sacrifices, in the tabernacle and later in the temple, you had a sacrificial system whereby atonement was made for sin through the sacrifice of various animals. And Jesus himself and the authors of the New Testament think of Jesus as being the ultimate sacrificial offering to God to make atonement once and for all for the sins of mankind, so that in his sacrificial death on the cross, he fulfills all of these Jewish antecedents or foreshadowing of a decisive atonement for sin that will reconcile us to God and bring forgiveness and pardon and cleansing.
So who's correct here? Is Ben Shapiro correct in saying that Jesus Christ was just a rabble-rouser and one of the Jewish political leaders that tried to do a revolt against the Roman Empire and then got caught by the Romans and executed as a criminal? Or is actually William Lane Craig's an airtight case that Jesus Christ was the Messiah that was prophesied in the book of Daniel, in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Zechariah, and in other books, even including from Deuteronomy by Moses, who said there would be a prophet just like him who would come and lead his people Israel? So who's right? Here's the evidence. When Jesus Christ declared himself to be the Son of Man, he was actually quoting from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, where it showed that there was someone like the Son of Man that came to the Ancient of Days, which was Yahweh, which is another name for Yahweh, the Creator God, and he took the seat upon the throne, and he had authority over every nation and every power in the universe. So the question is, if that Son of Man had that much power and he was equal with God, then when Jesus Christ claimed equality with God, wasn't he actually just comparing himself to the Son of Man of the book of Daniel? And the same thing could be said to the Greeks, who thought that there was a son of God, basically like Zeus fathered some kids through other human means, and then there was Hercules, who was a son of God. But he wasn't that kind of son of God who was equal with the Creator God. There were mythological figures, and they were based on myth and fiction, and they weren't based on a historical person who lived, died, and resurrected, as the Gospels proclaim. So the importance of Jesus Christ claiming to be the Son of Man was actually claiming that he was divine, because the Jews at that time thought that him claiming to be that was him claiming equality with God. And the thing is, Jesus didn't just claim to be the Messiah, as Ben says, because he said that there was many people at that time and 100, 200 years ago before Christ who claimed to be the Messiah. And that's true. There were many false messiahs in Israel a few hundred years before Christ who claimed to be the Messiah, and they tried to lead a revolt against the Greeks and the Romans. But the difference between Jesus Christ and all of those political messiahs was that he claimed to be God, the I am from the Torah, and it was completely unacceptable to the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, and the Jewish leaders that he claimed to have equality with God. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8:58, he said that I and the Father are one, meaning that he was claiming complete equality with God. And to claim that, to not just claim to be the Messiah, but to claim equality with God, was actually punishable by death. The conclusion is that Jesus claimed to be God, and that's why he was crucified by the Jewish leaders, but he also didn't meet the expectations of the Jewish leaders for a political Messiah, because Jesus Christ was more concerned about saving people from the tyranny of sin, which was actually ruling everybody, the Jews and the Gentiles and the Romans, and now all of us are ruled by the tyranny of sin. So the thing is, what separated Jesus from all the other messiahs also was his resurrection from the dead. His resurrection, as William Lane Craig stated, was vindication that the man who was rejected as a blasphemer and who was labeled as a common criminal, that his sacrifice on the cross was actually accepted by God. Isaiah chapter 53, which I will read before I finish this video, is literally a chapter that gives direct evidence of Jesus Christ fulfilling the suffering servant passages that were written about him. Zechariah chapter 9 says that the Messiah would enter the city gates on a donkey and that he would come from humble beginnings. Case in point, Jesus came from humble beginnings, from a carpenter's family, and lived a relatively obscure life until the start of his public ministry at age 30. And the other shocking thing is that Ben Shapiro finds the arguments for the resurrection uninteresting, as he said in the video. Why? If he's interested after the truth, as he always tries to debate people, whether they're supporters of liberalism, Marxism, or transgenderism, he always wants to get to the truth. He always goes against things like socialism, Marxism, which are evil, and tries to get to the truth of what actually works in human society. But he doesn't want to get to the truth on who Jesus Christ was, because it challenges his most sacred beliefs that there cannot be a Messiah that is not political, as him and many other Jews over thousands of years have thought. The thing is, how do we know that the Gospels are actually accurate? William Lane Craig presented some good evidences, and I want to present some more as well. The Gospels were written early based on several factors. A lot of scholars claim the Gospels were written for 30 to 40 to 50 years later after the death of Christ. But there's a few key indicators that mention the Gospels are written actually within the 15 to 20 years of Christ's resurrection. The thing is, the New Testament fails to mention the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, which was destroyed by the Roman Emperor Titus. The thing is, it stands to reason, if it was destroyed after 70 AD and the Gospels were written after 70 AD, or it was destroyed in 70 AD and the Gospels were written after 70 AD, that they would mention the destruction of the temple, which would be a powerful confirmation of the prophecy of Jesus Christ, which stated in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that the temple would be destroyed and that every stone in the temple will be not on top of one another anymore. So that means that the Gospels had to be written before AD 70. Additionally, Luke was written before the book of Acts, which was about the Acts of the Apostles and what they did after Jesus came back from the dead. And the book of Acts doesn't mention the death of Peter and Paul. And Luke's gospel is also quoted at certain points of 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy by the Apostle Paul. So the early dating of Acts allows us to date Matthew and Mark to even earlier than the writing of Acts, being that Luke is repeated or quoted often in passages from Mark and Matthew. That means that we actually might have already had the first Gospels within 12 to 15 to 20 years after the crucifixion event of Jesus Christ. And the thing is, in this final objection to the resurrection of Christ, Ben Shapiro mentions a guy who claimed to be the Messiah back in the 90s. He says, well, he might be resurrected from the dead, but we don't know. The thing is, that guy's been lying dead in New York City since 1994. And yes, a small number of Jews claim that he's alive, but it's almost like claiming that the people have seen Elvis after he died. It's a very small amount of people, and there's no corroborating evidence. There's no over 500 to thousands of witnesses, as the Gospels and the book of Acts claimed and showed that people actually saw this guy walking around New York City. So just because somebody claims to be resurrected, it doesn't match the resurrection account and the historicity of who Jesus Christ was. The thing is, Jesus's tomb is empty, where Ben Shapiro's claimed Jewish savior is still in the same grave he's buried in. Jesus's post-resurrection appearances were reported over 500 times, and many of those people faced death for believing in Christ to follow the Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. And even Jesus' own family only believed in him after Jesus Christ was resurrected. Paul, the enemy of Christ, who was actually a historical figure even by the most secular scholars, believed in Christ after he claimed he had a vision, and he came from being a total enemy to a total supporter of Christianity and became the foremost writer of most of the books of the New Testament. How did that happen if Jesus Christ was just a common criminal, as Ben Shapiro claims? And the thing is, there's another evidence that shows that Jesus Christ was more than just a man. The thing is, becoming a Christian at that time meant that you had no material benefit. It meant that you lost wealth, you lost power, you didn't gain any woman and had any more sexual partners because you became a Christian. So the thing is, I respect Ben Shapiro on his arguments in politics and how he stands up for certain truth that are self-evident truth in our culture, but his rejections to the resurrected Christ do not stand up to the evidence that demands a verdict. When we understand the evidence of the resurrection of Christ, we understand that Jesus Christ actually was God and that he did come to die for our sins, and that it's through Jesus Christ alone that we can have peace with God. The thing is with Ben Shapiro is that he is stuck in a very hardened state, and he has heard the truth, he knows the truth, he's around a lot of Christians who also tell him the truth, but it is really not an argument on his mind that is keeping him from following Christ. It's his heart, because if his heart was really opened up to the Old Testament prophets that he quotes and claims to believe in, he would understand that Isaiah 53 is one of the most amazing, miraculous passages that confirms Jesus Christ's divinity, and that only Jesus Christ fulfilled Isaiah 53. And I want to read that really quick before I sign off on this video. And I hope you guys are blessed by this message, and also blessed by what I'm about to read about who Jesus Christ really was and how he was prophesied in the Old Testament. So Isaiah 53 says, "Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. And like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days, The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. And by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was murdered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors.